Anika Sharma, just 23, thought she had found safety and a fresh start in New York, but her boss, Rajiv Malhotra, hid a dangerous secret that would turn her dreams into a nightmare and end her life in a shocking betrayal that stunned everyone who knew her. At 23 years old, Anika Sharma believed her life was finally moving forward. She had grown up in a small Indian town where opportunities were rare and expectations were heavy. Her father's illness and mounting debts had pushed her to look for work far beyond what she had ever imagined. When a distant contact mentioned a housekeeping job in New York for a wealthy Indian-American family, it sounded unreal, almost dangerous, but also impossible to ignore. The salary alone was more than her family earned in years. After weeks of paperwork, borrowed money, and sleepless nights, Anika boarded a plane for the first time in her life. New York did not welcome her gently. The cold air, the noise, and the endless movement made her feel invisible and exposed at the same time. She arrived with a single suitcase and a heart full of fear mixed with hope. The house she was taken to stood on a quiet suburban street in Queens, far from the bright lights she had imagined. It was large, clean, and carefully organized, but it did not feel warm. From the outside, it looked like the perfect place to begin a new life. Her employer, Rajiv Malhotra, was a successful businessman known in the local community. He traveled often, worked late, and lived behind an image of respect and discipline. His wife was rarely home, spending long periods abroad. Anika was told to focus on cleaning, cooking, and staying out of the way. She followed every instruction carefully, afraid of making mistakes that could cost her everything. She reminded herself daily that this job was not just about her. It was about survival for her entire family back home. Days turned into weeks, and the loneliness began to settle in. Anika had no friends, no relatives, and no understanding of the city outside the house. Her phone calls home were brief and carefully optimistic. She described New York as beautiful, her job as safe, and her future as secure. In truth, she often cried at night, overwhelmed by silence and fear. She felt trapped between gratitude and isolation. Slowly, the atmosphere inside the house began to change. Rajiv started noticing her more. At first, it was small gestures, extra food, casual help with paperwork, advice about living in America. To Anika, these moments felt like protection in an unfamiliar world. She had been taught to respect authority, and she trusted those who appeared kind and successful. She did not see danger in attention, she saw safety. As time passed, Rajiv's presence became more frequent. His absences shortened, and the house no longer felt empty. Anika felt confused by the shift, but convinced herself that it was normal. She believed she was simply earning trust. The power difference between them was something she never fully understood. To her, he was a guide in a foreign land. To him, she was someone with no voice, no status, and no protection. Anika's dependence on the job grew stronger with each passing day. Her family began relying on the money she sent. Their pride turned into relief, and her sacrifice was praised. She could not tell them about her loneliness or fear. Admitting doubt would mean admitting failure. She pushed her instincts aside and focused on staying useful, quiet, and grateful. Unknowingly, Anika was stepping into a life that would soon spiral out of control. What she believed was a chance for stability was actually the beginning of a dangerous imbalance. In a city filled with millions of people, she was completely alone. The house that promised safety would later become the place where her story began to darken, long before anyone realized how tragic it would become. The line between kindness and control slowly disappeared, though Anika did not notice it at first. Life inside the house followed a quiet routine, but the atmosphere felt heavier than before. Rajiv's attention toward her became more personal and more constant. He asked about her past, her struggles, and her dreams. In a foreign country where she felt invisible, being noticed made her feel valued. She believed this attention came from care, not realizing how carefully it was calculated. Anika's emotional isolation made her vulnerable. She had no social life, no coworkers, and no safe place outside the house. Rajiv became her only connection to the world beyond her phone screen. He explained legal terms she didn't understand, offered reassurance about her visa, and spoke about future plans that sounded comforting. To Anika, these words felt like security. She trusted him because she needed to trust someone. Over time, the relationship turned into something secret and dangerous. Anika believed she was involved in something meaningful. She imagined that patience would eventually bring her stability and respect. Rajiv fed these beliefs with promises that always remained just out of reach. He spoke of fixing things later, of complicated situations that needed time. Each excuse pushed Anika deeper into emotional dependence. Meanwhile, Anika continued sending money home. Her family's expectations grew, and so did her pressure to succeed. She could not tell them that her life was built on fear and uncertainty. She described her employer as helpful and generous, hiding the truth even from herself. Admitting the reality would mean accepting that she had lost control of her own life. As months passed, Anika began to notice changes in Rajiv's behavior. He became distant at times, irritated at others. His promises became vague, his attention shifted without explanation. Anika sensed that something was wrong, but she did not know how to protect herself. Her position in the house made her replaceable, disposable, and powerless. The truth revealed itself slowly and painfully. Anika discovered signs that Rajiv was involved with another woman. This realization shattered the future she had imagined. The security she believed in suddenly felt fake. Fear replaced hope. She understood that everything she relied on could disappear overnight. For the first time, Anika thought about what would happen if she were forced out. She had no savings, no legal protection, and no support system. Panic set in. She began documenting small details, not fully understanding why, only knowing she needed proof of something. She saved messages, dates, and moments that made her uncomfortable. This was not a plan for revenge, but a desperate attempt at survival. Her behavior changed. She became cautious, quieter, and more observant. Rajiv noticed the shift. What he once saw as obedience now felt like risk. Anika's awareness made him uneasy. The power he held over her was threatened by her growing understanding of the situation. Anika considered leaving the house, but fear stopped her. She worried about immigration trouble, about disappointing her family, about losing everything she had worked for. Each day became a balance between endurance and anxiety. She lived in constant tension, unsure of what move would keep her safe. The affair that once felt like a hidden escape now felt like a trap closing in. Anika realized she was no longer protected by silence. The secrets she carried were no longer harmless. Without knowing it, she had crossed an invisible line. What she believed was love had become leverage, and in a house that looked peaceful from the outside, danger was quietly building, waiting for the moment it would explode. The tension inside the house grew heavier with each passing day. Anika could feel it in the silence, in the way footsteps sounded closer than before, and in the sudden changes in routine. Rajiv's behavior had shifted completely. He no longer offered reassurance or guidance. His presence felt watchful, calculating, as if he was constantly measuring risk. Anika sensed that she was no longer someone he needed to impress, but someone he needed to control. She began to push back in quiet ways. She asked questions about her documents, about money she was owed, and about the future he once described so confidently. These questions were not demands, but they carried weight. Rajiv understood that Anika now saw through his promises. More importantly, he understood that she had evidence. The messages she saved and the notes she kept represented exposure, something that could destroy the image he had built over years. Fear changed both of them, but in different ways. Anika feared abandonment, deportation, and betrayal. Rajiv feared loss of power, reputation, and control. In his world, those losses were unacceptable. What Anika saw as a plea for stability, Rajiv saw as a threat that needed to be removed. Around this time, Anika quietly told someone she trusted that she planned to leave the house soon. She spoke about finding work elsewhere, about starting over. This decision gave her a sense of strength, but it also increased the danger. Rajiv noticed signs that she was preparing for something. Her silence felt deliberate. Her movements felt cautious. To him, it confirmed his worst fears. The final days were marked by unnatural calm. The house appeared normal, but the air was tense. Anika tried to stay invisible, avoiding attention, counting the hours. She believed that if she stayed careful long enough, she could escape without conflict. She did not know that the decision had already been made for her. One evening, the routine was broken. The details would later confuse investigators. There were no signs of forced entry. Nothing of value was taken. The scene inside the house felt incomplete, as if something had been rushed. When Anika was found, it was clear that this was not an accident. The violence had been sudden and intentional, designed to silence rather than steal. Rajiv's reaction was carefully controlled. He reported the incident with a version of events that sounded calm and logical. He described Anika as quiet, hardworking, and distant. He suggested outside involvement, anything that pointed away from himself. On the surface, his story appeared believable. He was respected, wealthy, and composed. Anika, in contrast, was young, undocumented, and unseen by society. However, small details refused to fit. The timeline was inconsistent. The lack of struggle raised questions. Neighbors reported unusual activity, movements at hours that did not match Rajiv's statement. What looked like a random crime began to reveal the shape of something planned. As police examined the house, they noticed signs of cleaning in places that did not need it. Certain areas were spotless, while others were strangely neglected. It suggested panic, not routine. Investigators began to suspect that the scene had been altered to confuse them. Anika's disappearance from daily communication also raised alarms. She had missed scheduled calls home. Her phone activity stopped abruptly. These details, small on their own, formed a pattern that could not be ignored. What initially appeared to be a tragic incident involving a vulnerable worker soon turned into a dark investigation of power and fear. Anika's attempt to protect herself had triggered the very danger she hoped to escape. The moment she became a risk rather than a secret, her life was taken, and in that quiet house the truth waited, buried beneath lies that were already beginning to crack. The investigation changed direction once detectives stopped treating the case as a random act of violence. Every object in the house was examined again, this time with the assumption that the crime came from within. What first looked ordinary now felt deliberate. The absence of forced entry, the untouched valuables, and the carefully arranged spaces suggested familiarity. Whoever was responsible knew the house well and felt comfortable moving through it without fear. Rajiv's statements were reviewed closely. On the surface, they appeared consistent, but when compared with digital records, small contradictions surfaced. Phone data showed activity at times he claimed to be elsewhere. Financial records revealed unexplained transfers made shortly before Anika's death. These details did not prove guilt on their own, but they weakened the image of innocence he tried to maintain. The most damaging discovery came from Anika's personal belongings. Investigators found digital backups stored in places no one initially checked. These files revealed a hidden life Anika had carefully documented. Dates, messages, and notes painted a picture of a relationship built on manipulation and fear. More importantly, they showed that Anika had felt unsafe. She had not trusted the environment she lived in, even though it appeared stable from the outside. This evidence shifted the narrative completely. Anika was no longer seen as a silent victim of circumstance, but as someone who understood the danger she was in. The records suggested she was preparing for an exit, not planning confrontation. That detail mattered. It challenged the idea that the crime was spontaneous. It suggested motive rooted in panic rather than rage. As investigators reconstructed the final days, they noticed unusual gaps. Certain hours were unaccounted for. Surveillance footage from nearby homes showed movement that did not match Rajiv's timeline. A vehicle linked to the household appeared briefly in places it should not have been. These moments were short but significant. They hinted at planning and coordination. Another layer emerged when investigators noticed signs that the crime scene had been partially cleaned. It was not thorough enough to erase everything, but intentional enough to suggest outside help. Someone had assisted after the act, removing traces and delaying discovery. This realization expanded the case beyond a single suspect. Pressure increased as media attention grew. Rajiv's carefully built public image began to fracture. Associates distanced themselves. Past behavior was re-examined. Investigators uncovered patterns of control and secrecy that had gone unnoticed for years. What once looked like discipline and professionalism now appeared calculated and self-serving. The turning point came when evidence linked a second individual to the aftermath. Financial incentives, communication records, and timing aligned too closely to ignore. This person did not commit the act itself, but helped conceal it. Their involvement explained the rushed cleanup and the temporary disappearance of key items. It confirmed that the crime was not only planned, but protected. With this information, authorities moved quickly. Rajiv was arrested, no longer shielded by reputation or status. The case that once seemed uncertain now had structure. Motive, opportunity, and intent were clearly defined. Anika's records became the backbone of the prosecution, proving that her awareness and preparation had not been in vain. Yet the revelations brought no comfort. Each new detail reinforced how isolated Anika had been. Her attempts to safeguard herself were quiet and careful, born from fear rather than anger. The system that should have protected her failed until it was too late. By the end of the investigation, the truth was impossible to deny. This was not a crime of chance. It was the result of power misused and fear weaponized. The cracks in the perfect story had widened into fractures, exposing a reality far darker than anyone first imagined. Anika's voice, silenced in life, now echoed through evidence that refused to be ignored. The trial unfolded under intense public attention, not because Anika had been famous, but because the case exposed a reality many preferred to ignore. A young immigrant woman had lived and died in silence, while those around her benefited from her vulnerability. As evidence was presented, the carefully constructed image of stability and respectability surrounding the household collapsed piece by piece. The story was no longer about a tragic incident, but about deliberate choices driven by fear and self-preservation. Prosecutors focused on patterns rather than emotions. They showed how Anika's life had gradually narrowed until she depended on a single person for safety, income, and legal standing. Her records demonstrated awareness, not recklessness. She had not been careless or naive at the end. She had been cautious, observant, and preparing to leave. This detail reframed everything. The crime was no longer interpreted as a moment of anger, but as a calculated response to losing control. The involvement of a second person shocked many observers. The idea that someone could assist in hiding the truth, not out of desperation, but loyalty and financial gain, revealed how easily morality can bend under pressure. This assistance explained delays, altered evidence, and confusion that initially slowed the investigation. It also showed how power extends beyond a single individual when reputation and money are at stake. As the case progressed, Anika's background became clearer. She was described through records, habits, and routines rather than words. She worked consistently, sent money home regularly, and avoided attention. There was no sign of recklessness, only endurance. The contrast between her quiet existence and the chaos surrounding her death left a lasting impression on those following the case. The verdict brought accountability, but no closure. Justice arrived in a legal sense, yet nothing could restore what had been taken. Anika's family received answers they never wanted to hear. The life she had described to them over phone calls no longer existed. The dreams she carried across continents ended in betrayal far from home. Public reaction was intense but short-lived. Media attention eventually shifted elsewhere, as it always does. What remained was a lesson buried beneath headlines. Anika's story revealed how easily vulnerability can be exploited when systems fail to protect those without status or voice. Her isolation was not accidental. It was the result of imbalance, secrecy, and silence. In the aftermath, advocacy groups referenced the case as an example of hidden abuse within private homes. Laws were discussed, warnings were issued, but change moved slowly. Anika became a symbol rather than a person to most. her name attached to conversations about reform and responsibility. What made the story especially haunting was not just the crime itself, but how close Anika came to escaping it. Her preparations suggested hope, not resignation. She believed there was still time. That belief, quiet and fragile, was taken from her at the moment it mattered most. In the end, Anika's life was reduced to evidence files and court records, but her story carried weight beyond the case. It stood as a reminder that danger does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it grows in comfort, hides behind generosity, and waits for fear to do the rest. In a city filled with millions, a young woman disappeared into silence, leaving behind a truth that only surfaced after it was far too late.